Welcome to CivilNet. Today our guest is Dr. Pavel Baev. He's a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. He's here in Yerevan to participate in a conference organized by the Caucasus Institute. It's entitled Gathering Storm, Regional Security of the South Caucasus in the Context of the Crisis of the Global Order. Thanks for being here.
Yes, I'm very glad to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from the Caucasus Institute. Great conference we had.
Oh, of course. Glad to have you here. You said your last time was before COVID, and things have changed a lot before the revolution as well. So.
Oh yes, so many things have changed. It feels like ages ago. It feels like another era, and not only because of the war in Ukraine, but also because of the developments in the Caucasus.
It's been a very interesting time to be a Russia watcher. Back when I was in university, it was 20 years ago, and I took Russian foreign affairs courses, and the professor at that time basically felt like his golden age was over and not much going on in the sphere anymore. We had George W. Bush, and he kind of looked into Putin's soul, all that kind of stuff. Seemed like history was over. Well, that's changed quite a bit. I never would have imagined that we are where we are now, where it looks like we're sitting at the end of the liberal world order. So how will that change and impact Russia's foreign policy?
I think Russians imagine themselves as the main driver of the change, which they're probably not. But nevertheless, that's the self-perception that Russia is in the vanguard. Russia is a kind of champion of the destruction of the old, unfair, US-dominated hegemonic world order and a kind of harbinger of something entirely new. The problem is they had no idea what is new, because the concept of multipolar world was never really a concept. It's more kind of a label or a slogan. It's much easier to attack the world order as it still exists, or as it existed. I don't know when you've mentioned the George W. Bush, the beginning of Putin's era. But attacking and unraveling and deconstructing that world order brings a lot of problems, and I don't think Russia is really ready for that. Certainly China is the main beneficiary of the world order as it still exists, and Russia wasn't. Russia really wasn't quite able to find for itself a place, a role which will be rewarding and beneficial and opening an avenue for the future. So there is a lot of resentment in Russia about good old Soviet times, which were never good, which I really know too well what it really was. But then resentment is an emotion which very often defies all sort of facts and figures.
And the nostalgia?
Yes, which is typical even for generation which never was there. So they was there as so young, they can't really remember much. What is really shocking for me is that the decade of the 90s, which was a time for Russia of possible new beginning, of so many promises, of so many attempts to start something new and, in a sense, progressive, to join the kind of the mainstream of the global development. That decade is now perceived as a complete failure. A decade is seen as a fiasco, as a false start, as a really period when Russia was neglected, humiliated, discarded. So the feeling now is we are now on the track of restoring Russia's greatness. So it's not just the kind of Trump's famous hat. It's very much the sentiment from this new start of Putin's presidency from the year 12. Because in the interregnum, when Medvedev was president, there was still a lot of feelings about modernization, about new partnership with the West, about a restart with the United States, reset. But with Putin's return in the year 12, it was a very sharp break with that. because protests that Putin encountered returning to power suddenly revealed to him that modernization means you rely on modernizers. And all the modernizers in Moscow were in the street protesting against him. Doesn't work. Something else was needed, and he found that something else, first in Crimea in the year 14, then in Syria in the year 15, and certainly the culmination of this trend was the invasion into Ukraine in February 22, 3 and something years ago, which changed everything.
And when also bringing it down here to our region, we saw increased Russian influence with the end of the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War. And it seemed like at the time, Russia had emerged as the leading and really sole mediating power at that point. The Minsk group that it had been a part of was kind of put aside, where only Russia was calling the shots. The conventional wisdom I kept hearing was that when Russian peacekeepers enter, they never leave. And that's not how it turns out. As we know, they are no longer there, which came as a surprise, I think, to everyone. I didn't hear a single person at the time say, oh, Russia will leave early. They were talking about extensions, but no, in fact, they're completely expelled from Karabakh. So have Russia's strategic objectives in the South Caucasus shifted, especially since the 2023 ethnic cleansing, which kind of got rid of their reason for being there? And will its role evolve or maybe a comeback like they want?
I think the whole war of the year 2020, which came as a shock for Moscow, which really thought that this neither peace nor war situation can drag on, and the kind of Minsk talks can continue, well, fruitless, but nevertheless habitual. Yes, there were certainly spasms of violence before that, but the intensity of that war, the ability of Azerbaijan to prevail in that clash, the role of Turkey, all that came as a big surprise for Moscow, and they thought that they achieved a new sustainable status quo by deploying their peacekeepers. But obviously that was more another misreading in Moscow of the dynamics in the region. Because, well, surprise of the war was just one thing, but all the underlying dynamics which resulted in, which brought that war and determined its outcome, was still underestimated in Moscow, underanalyzed. Too many other kind of distractors at the moment, including certainly the pandemic, which I think influenced a lot the quality and the character of decision-making in the Kremlin. And when the one and only decider is so deep into self-isolation, it was difficult to expect sufficient attention, sufficient research and risk assessment in the Caucasus. Attention was very quickly shifting towards this topic which really obsessed this great leader in his self-isolation, Ukraine. So Caucasus was saying, okay, we sorted that out, that situation is now frozen in a different configuration, we can turn our back to that. We, I mean, Russian policymakers. And that was another mistake. It was very obviously a blunder which pales into insignificance when you're comparing it with the blunder of the decision to unleash the war in Ukraine. But nevertheless, probably it's a typical example of the quality of policy analysis, policy planning, strategic preparations in the Kremlin at that time.
Now, well, it's funny because the conventional wisdom, amongst Armenians at least, is that Russia planned this out right from the beginning with Azerbaijan. But you also do mention how there was a lot of distractions, and that is why Azerbaijan went when they did. Besides COVID, which was a horrible distraction, also the election in the United States, and everyone was busy. So you're saying Russia did not see this coming whatsoever.
In 2020?
Yeah, 2020.
No, I don't think there was any... The thinking in Moscow was, yes, there are always tensions there, there are always some shooting, there are always some minor incidents, but generally the situation is manageable.
Now,
and I think one element of that situation Russia miscalculated in particular was the role of Turkey.
And we know that Turkey and Azerbaijan together, it's been feeding a kind of a new power center in the South Caucasus. Russia is mostly out now. Azerbaijan is in, and it even seems like in some ways Azerbaijan is the one kind of bossing Turkey around on some issues. So what does this mean for Russia? I can't believe it's too happy about that, or what's going on between the two of them?
The kind of trajectory of relations between Russia and Turkey is indeed very peculiar one. And the chemistry between Putin and Erdogan is very fluid. It's kind of very odd cocktail of feelings, but generally trust was never part of that cocktail. And I think step by step Erdogan was pushing Russia in several different theaters and conflict zones, probably starting in Libya in the year 19, when, with the help of Turkey, the offensive on Tripoli by Marshal Haftar and the Wagner group was stopped. And then continuing in Syria, where Erdogan refused to allow Russia and the Assad regime to finish the job in Idlib. The ceasefire was signed, which essentially meant Idlib was off limits, remained as a kind of bastion for rebels, and exactly from that bastion then the breakdown, the collapse of the Assad regime was orchestrated. And into that kind of sequence of moves by Erdogan, I think the war in around Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 fitted perfectly. That was a pattern, and the kind of, on each of these episodes, Putin was unhappy, but always made a choice that it's not worth a major quarrel with Turkey. There is a kind of bigger game to engage with. There is a kind of larger goal to pursue, and that goal was Ukraine. So I think that neglect, that lack of attention, lack of investment of political capital in the affairs in the Caucasus wasn't kind of just a happening. It was a well-established trend, and I think we probably can expect it will continue, because the war in Ukraine demands so much concentration of Russian resources, attention, passions, that Russia is not really able to give the necessary attention for expanding its influence in the Caucasus to the degree needed if the ambition is to keep it under as your zone of influence.
Well, that kind of goes into my next question, which is, Armenia has been pivoting to the West, especially after Russia's failure to keep Armenia's security. We had the CSTO agreements, which don't seem to be worth much of anything, far as I can tell, with the attacks from Azerbaijan. And this was not just Nagorno-Karabakh, but here Armenia itself getting shot at, 2022, for example. And so do you see Armenia's pivot as a wise move, or with these new dynamics, with people talk about an ascendant Trump Russia, should Armenia be reconsidering?
It is a very fluid situation, and Trump and Putin is a game which is still very new, which might break down, because in that game Trump wants from Putin things which Putin is not prepared to give. Trump's idea of how to strike a deal is very different from kind of Putin's tactical maneuvers. We don't know how Trump will take the fiasco of his big plan to bring the war in Ukraine to a quick end. It was one telephone conversation, another telephone conversation, not particularly productive, and Trump still tries to spin it positively, but it's only that much he can do that. But it is a question of kind of these bilateral relations. As for Armenia's pivot to the West, which is probably more a pivot to Europe than to the West, since the United States is hardly a place you can now pivot to, I think that it gives you Armenia a bit more freedom of maneuver. It's impossible to put all your stakes on your alliance with Russia. It doesn't work. So you need a bit more kind of multi-vector approach. You need better ties, certainly, with across the Black Sea in that region. You need probably better ties, attempt to rebuild relations with Turkey, which I think is not impossible at all, because Turkey is generally, yes, Azerbaijan is putting pressure, Azerbaijan is kind of cutting it short, but nevertheless there are openings and opportunities. So I think Armenia needs to explore every opening it has, because certainly the situation after the collapse of Artsakh is entirely different. It's in a sense, it's probably, if to what degree I can judge, a bit of a burden off Armenian shoulders. The conflict was really a heavy pressure. It might be possible to find some new space, to find some new dynamics and some new energy for getting the country moving forward faster.
Last question is, looking ahead, which is probably impossible, so I won't put too much pressure on you, but we did wonder if you have any thoughts on what the future for Russia's presence in the South Caucasus might be, in the next decade or so.
I don't think there is a big future for Russia in the South Caucasus. And I don't think Russia is able to do what many Western experts accuse it of doing, of rebuilding the empire. Imperial project is not just projecting military power. You need for that a lot of soft power to rely upon. You need kind of an imperial project which would mean something. And you look at what Russia has become in the course of this 3-year-long war and counting, and you see how many elements of of Russia's strengths other than military are degraded and diminished and curtailed, from sports to higher education. A lot of what made Russian culture interesting has emigrated or being pressed down. So many Russian economy, for that matter, is in far deeper trouble than probably Putin understands or wants to understand. So I don't think that in the situation, even if the war is kind of put on pause, even if the war some sort of armistice is agreed, that theater will continue to demand from Russia prime attention. Ukraine is not going to waste the pause. I think there is a strong determination in Ukraine to rehabilitate, to rearm, to rebuild the industrial base, whatever. And this Ukraine will remain a massive problem for Russia. So I don't think Russia will have resources or even interest for devoting energy to the South Caucasus. I don't think Russia is coming back.
Well, that's a really interesting way to conclude it, very concise. Thank you so much. It's really gives us another way to look at things compared to what we've been hearing lately over the past few months. So I appreciate your vantage.
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts. And again, expert knowledge can give you only that much, because so many developments go against all expert predictions.
Well, we're going to keep on watching and see what happens. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
And thank you for joining CivilNet.